Well, good evening and welcome. I so appreciate each and every one of you taking a little bit of time out of your Tuesday evening to be with us here. This presentation is actually over 4 years in the making. This was an idea that we had back in 2019, and I believe we actually had it on the schedule, but then this little thing called COVID-19 happened, and it sort of got put off until tonight, and here we are. It is a great pleasure to be sitting before you this evening. And when we originally started thinking about doing this show, the idea was not to make it a KNND specific presentation, but kind of talk about the overall history of media in Cottage Grove. That means radio as well as the newspaper. And Debbie mentioned the symbiotic relationship that has existed over my years at the station with the Cottage Grove Sentinel, because radio and newspaper are two very different mediums, and there's different things that one does better than the other. And so you might think of the newspaper and the radio sort of being at odds with each other because this is a small town and we're sort of taking away, we're sort of cutting up a fairly small pie when it comes to people's marketing dollars. And I understand back in the history there's been periods when maybe there was a little bit of tension between the radio station and the newspaper, but I'm happy to say that over my years at the radio station, the station and the newspaper have collaborated on a number of things, and as Debbie mentioned, we put our heads together every month on the Beeper Show to talk about current events, because there's certain things that the radio station covers more and certain things that the Sentinel does more of. So we kind of all put our knowledge together to give the people of our community a more complete picture of what we're doing. So that having been said, we wanted to kind of do a little bit of both here for you tonight. And with that, we'll hop back in the time machine and go back to where this all kind of started. So Gerald, why don't you get us going?
Sure. So yes, the competitiveness, those values have always been there. They've always been in news. News is about competition. It's to see who can get the story there first. And so with our story, we are going to have a bit of background here. So as Cameron explained, we'll do about 10-15 minutes of background and then we'll start getting into KNND stuff. But we do want to approach this with a scope. And so with that said, in 1892, we had the creation of the Associated Press. And this came really out of the creation of the New York Associated Press. These were 5 different newspapers that wanted to share the costs of transmitting the news from the Mexican-American War. News has always been kind of expensive, and words by the figures that people were putting on the value of news items that people were buying were kind of tough. And so these 5 newspaper competitors all shared the costs. And so naturally, when you hear about those things, you think about monopolies. And that's kind of really what happened. Even at price per word, it was kind of expensive. So the New York AP, 5 different newspapers all banded together and started to share news stories with one another, but left the Western Associated Press out of the mix. They wanted to let them buy their own news because they came out of Illinois. And those folks from Illinois looked into what the NYAP was doing. They found a whole bunch of shady stuff going on in there. So by 1892, they were completely disbanded, and the Western Associated Press incorporated as the Associated Press, and that was the company that was left after the dust was settled. But much of America was still kind of Dust Bowl in many ways. Here in Cottage Grove, we were starting to build up our population, and at the same time, we also wanted to build up our foundation for news. So there was a newspaper that was started called the Cottage Grove Leader. Within 2 years of the Leader, there was a competitor newspaper called the Cottage Grove Messenger that arrived. And the Cottage Grove Messenger was really more like hard news. It focused on town stuff that the leader was really not doing. And by 1899, we reached the point where C.J. Howard, a Dorena resident, really sort of took over the town news. And he put in a lot of work to becoming the editor of the Cottage Grove Messenger. He quickly renamed it the Bohemian Nugget. And that's how that was born. But Howard was also not only the editor of the paper, but he was also the postmaster of Cottage Grove. So he was starting to understand that news and news traveling to faraway lands could be something of the future. So in a 1899 edition of the Bohemian Nugget, he described how a fraternal bureau of folks who can gather in Cottage Grove and talk about news and their views could really become something interesting. And it was cool that in this particular edition, he pointed out that if you can gather people like this, the formation of this bureau could really bring the merits of South Lane to a greater audience. And it's interesting that he called those merits a broadcast, which is kind of interesting. It was kind of one of the first times that that was ever used. But by 1909, we had Lou Cates. And Lou Cates came out of St. Louis, Missouri, and he drove to Oregon hoping to buy a newspaper. And he could have purchased the Oregon newspaper called the Tillamook Headlight, but he passed on it, and instead he decided to buy the Cottage Grove Messenger. It was a different newspaper than the Leader, but when he took it over, he quickly rebranded that and he called it the Cottage Grove Sentinel. And he relied heavily on local regional news, but he had some money, so he was able to purchase a lot of the AP wire stuff that was coming out at the time. By 1912, we had what's called the Radio Act that was passed. And so the Radio Act really kind of brought forward a lot of news gathering to the table. The United States hadn't ratified a convention that international countries had all signed. That happened in 1906, so they were sort of hemming and hawing over what to do with that. But they put a lot of pressure on them by 1912 and decided that we're going to go without the United States. This is the international news gatherers. We're going to go without the United States in this radio telegraph convention. We've all signed it. The United States is not signing it. Let's go forward. Let's leave them behind. And by April 1912, the United States decided to sign it. They went for it, and 2 weeks later, we had the Titanic tragedy that happened. And that was probably, if not the biggest news of the previous century, then of all time. And there was a survivor on the Titanic that came to Cottage Grove during that time. And there aren't very many pictures of them because, again, news was really expensive, and to get photographs on the page was really difficult. That hadn't really been invented yet. But yeah, the Radio Act is really kind of what brought things together. And they started testing the Radio Act right away. They started testing the waters on the Radio Act because radio was really available for many years before that, but we really had to have some rules. And who did they chase after to sort of define what the rules were? But a little kid from New York. And in 1913, there was a story that was ran in the Sentinel through the AP, and it read, Elmer B. Myers, a Brooklyn youth who set up a wireless plant on the roof of his home without first obtaining a federal license to do so, was fined $50 by U.S. Judge Mayer for violation of the Radio Act, which was passed in June. Do you believe that? $50.
$50 was a lot of money back in 1913.
It was $1,532 that his
In today's value. Wow.
Yeah, I'm sure his parents had to pay that. But here we have right next to that story one of the first radio transmitters that went up, and that was in San Diego. It's called Chola. What is it? Yes, it's called a Chola receiver. By 1917, war came around again, and then United States entered it through presidential order, and all of the country's radio stations were taken over for naval use only at this time. And so Forest Service outfits by the 1920s began testing out instruments in Eugene. Human voices were picked up when they were testing out these instruments, and it was learned that the voices were coming from Portland through telephone apparatuses that people were hacking back then to create radios. And so in 1921, January 1921, we had the Oregon Agricultural College radio that came on. And they were trying to negotiate with the radio club from Washington University to establish a system of wireless communications here. All of the schools wanted to talk to each other and know what's going on, kind of like an early system of email. So they wanted that, and it came on. And so KOAC was first licensed with the call letters KFDJ, and that changed. It was a forerunner to Oregon State University. By 1922, a military club here in Cottage Grove installed a radio receiving unit at the Armory. Not the armory that we know of behind this particular building, but there was another armory right next to where Sunshine General Store used to be. So if you're familiar with that building, which was previously a Masonic lodge as well, it was used to entertain members of the military company. And these particular entertainers, or the particular entertainment was all coming through the radio. The general public was allowed to come in every once in a while and hear the radio. But I have a little map here so that you can see where the building was in case you're not really oriented or familiar with maybe where it could be. It's just on the other side of the river. By July of that year, there was, where the Holloman Ford building is, there was another family who owned it. Their last name was Woodson, and they were some of the first families to start bringing cars into Cottage Grove, so they were selling them left and right. But by 1922, radio became really, really popular. And so they created what was called a Great Caravan. So initially, they really just wanted to host demonstrations and lectures for radio that was coming into town, but they decided to, sort of go above and beyond, and they all gathered in cars, and they would drive around. They would get out of the cars and do these kind of shows. Lectures were had, movies were done, and radio concerts were also promoted as well. These were by the Woodson brothers. And you can see the old Holloman Ford building in this picture right in the background here. When the Salem Cherryans came to town, these were all folks from Salem who came to celebrate cherry season. Yeah, I wonder where they went. So by 1923, the Woodsons had a radio outfit in their own home. And they were in the news as exhibiting radio show for friends of theirs that came from McMinnville. And the radio show was on between 8 and 9 o'clock. And according to the story here that I have, the Woodsons were able to hear the concert, and clearly as though they had attended it in person, of course, because that's how clear radio was back then. But from grandmothers to flappers, anybody could basically enjoy radio for what it was worth back then. So these radio machines, they were reported in the Cottage Grove Sentinel, and people started getting really smart about it, like E.C. Spray. He was a local business person here who started selling radios, and he put out a little advertisement that was more like copy, where he said, why put $200 or more into a gramophone that you must continue to buy records for when you can get a good radio set for the same or less money? Yep. Why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free? And that's what people wanted to really know about. They wanted to know the price of milk. They wanted to know what people were out there buying and selling. So Oregon Agricultural College, the radio station, started broadcasting from there in 1923, which is really cool. By 1924, we had all kinds of things going on. President Harding spoke 4th of July the previous year. People from Cottage Grove were going to go to Eugene, but instead, radios came into town, so they decided just to stay home and listen to it live on the air. It was reported by that time that there were over 145,000 radio sets that people owned throughout the country, over 150 government wireless stations. But due to the Radio Act of 1912, the Department of Commerce prohibited even the mere act of mentioning that people had called into the radio station. That was still illegal and against the law. So the Federal Radio Commissions, this was a precursor to the FCC, supervised radio really hard there. They wouldn't allow callers, but people were still trying to figure out what to do even if they couldn't call in. And in 1925, radios were being sold left and right. One of our older pioneers in town here, Ray Nelson, who was a Bohemian miner, had Radio Ray, had a radio shop, and he sold RCA units. For instance, one called Regenoflex. And the Regenoflex, Cameron, came as a smaller wooden cabinet with gold Art Deco painted as wood trim on the cabinet. It had a beautiful horn-shaped radiola speaker, or you can put on headphone bridles that could be used with the set. The radio had 5 dials that were really small. You can see the picture on there. They're very, very much like this one next to this person listening to it. It had a volume control, 2 station selectors that both went up only to 6, and an application knob. I'm not sure what the application knob was for, but that went up to 3. And its range was between 220 to 550 meters. So by 1935, radio was very popular. In 1929, there was a musician named Jack Little from St. Paul, and he began doing guest appearances as Little Jack Little during live broadcasts and started putting live callers on the air. The AP called that moment an astounding event, noting that long-distance conversations to Dallas, Texas and Lima, Ohio occurred. It was all thanks to telephone microphone pickups at the time. But in 1935, the AP launched Wire Photo Network, which allowed transmission of news photographs over leased private telephone lines, and this gave the AP major advantage over news media outlets. Radio stations regularly began precursor radio call-in shows like NBC's America's Town Meeting of the Air. And that began in 1935 as one of the very first nation's talk shows. It didn't allow members of the public to come in, but they allowed them to call in, and they were answering phone calls back then. 1940s, here's where we're starting to get really close to KNND days here. So in the 1940s, the AP expanded from print to radio broadcast news. In 1941, it began distributing news to radio stations. In 1948, the Olympic ski champion Gretchen Fraser, that you can see there in the picture, She came to Eugene, and she's sitting there with the Eugene Chamber of Commerce at a dinner given in her honor. And signs for local ski clubs are positioned on the chairs for her. On her left, one of the delegates of the Oak Ridge Ridgers was there, and one of the Cottage Grove delegates, the Cottage Grove Bohemians, was there. And so the speaker's table is in the background with radio station KORE on the microphone. And Fraser there has a fur coat over her lap of the time. Shows like It's Your Nickel and Party Line became exciting early talk shows, though dangerous and unpredictable to put callers live on the air.
They didn't have the 7-second delay.
They did not. And imagine that, having people call in and say fart. Oh, what do you do? Okay. But
gall darn!
Oh, gall darn it. There's this guy named Joe Pine, and he came out of Pittsburgh, and he became legendary because he began this talk show. And when callers called in and started getting a little bit snarky, he began arguing with them on the air. And so he started debating on-air listeners. And here's where we get into the origins of the mighty 1400, Cameron, 1951. So the origins of the mighty 1400 really begins in this time. I found in a Federal Register handbook for radio applications in the National Archives that in July 1951, there was an entry that requested simultaneous code channel operation changes in Eugene and Cottage Grove cities by the Willamette Broadcasting Company on 1400 kilocycles at 250 watts of power and unlimited time by Philip S. Holtz by the Coast Fork Broadcasting Company. But who was the Willamette Broadcasting Company? Because they kind of appeared and then disappeared really quickly.
As did Philip Holt.
As did Philip Holt. It was kind of a buy and sell situation. And it appears that J. Elroy McCaw was a 50% owner of the Willamette Broadcasting Company. And J. Elroy McCall was an American businessman, as his Wikipedia entry states, who owned radio stations and television stations throughout the country. The dude was filthy rich, but he was also on the cutting edge. He really became the steward of some of the very first radio stations that started to adopt top 40 and rock and roll in the 1950s. So he was a bit of a legend, and he wanted to do the same here for Cottage Grove at the time. So that started in 1951, just thinking about what they were going to do.
But then we enter 1952.
Oh, yeah.
And a gentleman by the name of Gordon Allen.
That's right. So when we fast forward to 1952, next to an article about a youngster who pulled one of his baby teeth and hid it in his ear, yeah. There was a story written right out of the Washington AP through the AP wire. And in the Herald and News from Klamath Falls, it read, the Coast Fork Broadcasting Company out of Cottage Grove Thursday was granted a license by the Federal Communications Commission. That was it. That was it. That was how KCTG was born. And W. Gordon Allen was the radio station's owner, who purchased the station through Philip S. Holt, and he was in concert with a gentleman named John Truhan. John Truhan's name has kind of been left out of the mix because Gordon was really more of the personality behind the radio. He was also really kind of a famous person at the end of the day. When we kind of go back into the archive, we'll know that he did a whole bunch of cool stuff. He was a station owner and manager. He was also a film producer, an author, and a Saucerian. Yes, folks, this dude was into UFOs. Yeah, he was well known, most famous for a documentary called Overlords of the UFO that was made in 1976. And when this aired, it drove people crazy because he was on point about a lot of things, but people didn't want to believe it. And in January 14, 1953, Allen announced plans for operating a television station, a UHF channel station, Channel 20, out of the Eugene Springfield area. And Allen, he was the president of Coast Fork Broadcasting at this point, and he applied for the FCC license and was granted.
And the other stations that he owned, all of his stations had his initials in their call letters.
They did.
GA. So those call letters, the KCTG, those were very early in the history of the evolution of the station. And in fact, they had already been changed in January or in July of 1953 when the station actually went on the air. It never went on the air as KTCG. It was when it went on the air, it was KGAS.
That's right. So KCTG was sort of a placeholder for whoever was going to purchase the station. And a lot can be said about call letters, like WGN. It stands for World's Greatest News. So anybody can kind of develop the call letters and then put them on there. And we'll get into that for KNND in just a second. But yes, so right after January, the following month, the station in Salem and other assignments were reached, and a construction permit was granted for KCTG, and up it went for only $1,500. Yeah, that's all it took to get the radio station started. And July 23, 1953. So here we have the article, which finally ran in the Cottage Grove Sentinel at that time. And the headline, which read, radio station KSGA to begin broadcasting operations Sunday. The story read, Oregon's newest radio station, KSGA, here in Cottage Grove, will go on the air this Sunday, July 26. Frequency is 1400 on the dial, etc., etc. They transferred over the call letters from Redmond over to Cottage Grove. And special programs that were aired during that time that they were hoping to air was one featuring Bob Hope, another one with Bing Crosby, Jack Benny,
Bill Harris and Alice Faye, some of the big names on the radio in 1953.
Yeah,
and that article, Gerald, that you dug up from the archives, I love it. It was supposed to go on the air, KSGA was supposed to go on the air on July 26th of 1953 at 11 a.m. And the initial broadcast was supposed to be a direct broadcast from the Assembly of God Church, which was located at 724 Main Street here in Cottage Grove. And the service, the article went on to say, would be a weekly feature on the radio station with the Reverend W. White. Well, that didn't actually happen. No. Because as Gerald will note in his next slide, there was a little problem. See, the FCC gets a little mad when you go on the air without your permit. And when the initial broadcast was supposed to happen, the FCC had not as yet granted the radio station the permit to go on the air. They somehow things got a little bit delayed from the timeline that was supposed to happen. Yeah. So that Sunday broadcast didn't happen, and they were waiting for a telegram from Washington that would give them their permit. And they said, once we get the permit, we're going to go on the air, but we're going to hold up this very special series of programs that we were going to have for our opening day. We're going to put them on the following Sunday. And that's what they ended up doing.
That's what they ended up doing, yeah. The following week after this Sentinel article, there was a bit of an apology that was sent out to the listeners. It said that they were awaiting the permits to go on the air, that essentially they could start running the show even as early as Tuesday, whenever they get the permit, but they were waiting really until the following Sunday to go on the air. So it wasn't really July 26th that it came. That's when they were hoping to go on the air. They went on the air a week after.
And so Gordon Allen, he brought down this very interesting gentleman as a general manager. He brought him down out of Yakima, Washington.
Yeah, and his name was Anthony Maucione. And so Anthony brought his family with them, as most people do whenever they get a nice job somewhere. They bring their entire family. And he stated that the daily programming will consist primarily of music, news with a strong emphasis on local news and special event coverages. In addition to Macchioni as a staff member, there was also another person named Ron Harper, who was the chief engineer, a person named Robert Kennedy, who was also an engineer, and a secretary receptionist named Norma Schmidt, and another engineer that was still to be selected. I think the person selected was Rod Walter, because then we'll talk about him in just a little bit.
And everything was located out on Highway 99 at that time.
It was over at Highway 99, and we see here that the station looked, pretty bare bones, just a concrete block there with a few windows, transmitter on top of it, and that was all there was.
And I believe that was that area was affectionately known as the Swamp.
Was it called the Swamp? Now, they say that it was about a mile and a half south of town. Does anybody know exactly where it was, where it would be today? The building is still there? Really? Oh, I could have taken a picture.
It's on the right-hand side, so it's got...
Okay, I'll take a look at it. It looks familiar, but I can't recognize it because a lot of the peripheral is empty. Hey, Beth. So when we go into 1954 here, we're really moving along here with the next personality who owned the station. As we were talking about really early on, how television stations and radio stations sort of change hands really swiftly. It happened in Cottage Grove too. It was reported in the Salem Capital Journal only 10 months after the radio station started that Gordon Allen began to make moves to sell the station to Orlo M. Bagley, a Cottage Grove lumberman, and he was also a former high school football coach. He reportedly purchased KSGA from the Coast Fork Broadcasting Company for $27,000.
$27,200.
So it went up,
was the price, and it kept the value kept going up the next year, because when it was sold in 1960, it was sold for $35,000.
It was sold for $35,000, but this Gordon, man, he made a killing on this.
Oh yeah, for when you consider that he put it up for $1,500 and then he sold it for $27,200. Now Orlo Bagley, there's shades of his influence that is still with KNND today. Orlo Bagley was very involved with the Lions Club. And Orlo Bagley started a tradition that continues to this day called Lions Radio Days on KNND, where the radio station was essentially turned over to members of the Lions Club, and the Lions would go out and they would solicit ads from local businesses. The radio station received a very nominal sum, but the bulk of the money would stay with the Lions Club to help with the various projects that they did. And Lions Radio Days was always kind of fun, and is always kind of fun to listen to, because you learn about the Lions, and they play some cool records, and there's always trivia, and they give things away. So it's kind of something that has its own unique flavor. But that all started back in the 50s with Orlo Bagley. And
Bagley really was a turning point in the station. He stated that the station would continue to operate with a similar presentation. Personnel change was going to be the same, but the call letters would be different. The call letters were now KOMB. That's what he decided to change them to. With Orlo purchasing the station, he also wanted to change not only the call letters, but the company name altogether. So with his wife, Thelma, they sanctioned the FCC on an assignment to change business names from KOMB to radio station KOMB, and that's really important. It's also noted that sometime in 1956, Milton Viken joined the staff as the station's chief engineer at the time. And so he'll turn up in just a bit as well. You'll notice him in a few years after this. In around 1957, it was reported in the Statesman that the FCC had authorized KOMB, like we just talked about. And it was also reported around that time that there was a young person named James Cutbirth out of Eugene who accepted the position of chief radio telephone engineer at the Cottage Grove station KOMB, and that's where he had been announcing as a disc jockey, and he was still intending on attending school in Eugene during that time. They had a broadcasting school there, and so lots of people went there to learn the ropes. And here's a picture on the right-hand side from that era of perhaps a student, somebody sort of close to student age that was perhaps doing something similar. He's got his copy in front of them, and he's got his hand on some dials and his hand waiting for the record. He's queuing it up and talking it up.
So let's move on to 1960.
Sure, let's do that.
1960.
Okay.
It's around that time that the station was sold again.
Sure.
To Pete Ryan and Milt Deacon, who you mentioned a moment ago.
Sure. So I got a couple slides here, and I'll just quickly mention that by 1957, there were remote broadcasts happening all over the place. KOMB was going out and doing remote broadcasts with the stations KRNR and KRXL in Roseburg. And here we see an advertisement celebrating the Timberjacks who were coming to Cottage Grove. They were a country western band, and they were playing at the VFW Hall, dancing from 9 to 1 a.m., by the way. We know how to have a good time here in Cottage Grove. And so here are a couple of pictures of some folks doing a remote for you. In 1957, the Timberjacks were on tour. They were going to Drain soon thereafter. But look at this. Around the same time in November 1957, Johnny Cash was also in town in Roseburg playing.
Johnny Cash and the Tennessee 2 and Carl Perkins.
Oh, absolutely.
They were Mr. Blue Suede Shoes, that guy.
Mr. Blue
They
Suede
were all
Shoes.
on the Sun Records label together, and they were touring.
They were touring. They all came out of... they were coming through from Nashville, Tennessee, out of the Bradley station, Bradley Studios, and he was recording a lot of the pioneer country from the golden era, and so they were going on tour. And so if you see any of those old Country Style USA, you'll see all of these folks on there too. 1958, really quickly, let's touch on this. Orville Bagley. He began to think about running for the GOP. He wanted the nomination for the state house position in Lane County, and he tried in 1958. He didn't get it, but he was instrumental at starting up other radio stations. So he took Rod Walter back to Redmond and started up a radio station there called KJUN. Or KJUN was already a radio station, but he took that over and he brought Rod Walter with him. And we'll get to see also how this moment here in Orville Bagley's history was really kind of like the beginning of his political history as well. Coincidentally as well, Gordon Allen made a very short-lived candidacy for state senator through Marion County on the Democratic ticket. So Orville ran on the Republican ticket, and Gordon ran on the Democratic ticket in 1958, but he withdrew in June to focus more on Willamette Land Television Company. That was his studio. And here we are with 1960. And this is a really interesting moment in KNND's history because, as we know, KOMB was alive and well and running the show here in Cottage Grove. But it was reported in the Roseburg Review in March 1960 that an assignment of the license for radio station KOMB was going to be transferred over to Peter J. Ryan and Milton Beacon for $35,000. And that was honored on August 26, 1960. And so there we have a picture of Peter J. Ryan. And well, before we get into Peter, let's go into the facelift that KNND received.
Yeah, there was a couple of things that happened. It was around that time, there's a note that the FCC issued a new construction permit so that KNND was finally able to upgrade from 250 watts of power to 1,000 watts day and 250 watts at night, which was something that a lot of AM stations do, because if any of you who've ever spent time twiddling around your AM dial after dark, AM travels a long way. So you have to make sure that you're not going to be bleeding over somebody else who might be on 1400 elsewhere. And there was another thing that happened. So this is around the same time that you have the switch of the call letters from KOMB to KNND. And KNND was chosen, it was kind of a branding ploy actually, because it sounded like Candy Radio. KNND sounded like candy. So it was Candy Radio. Was what they were doing.
So there were no real changes to the personnel or to the programming at all, but the co-owners, Milt Beacon and Pete Ryan, it said here in the cut line to the picture, will think of something new in press agentry. Well, what they did was give it a facelift. The photo features an updated facade on the concrete block building on 99, but with the station's calls letters tacked onto the lip of the roof and a large candy cane in the parking lot with KNND inside of it, we kind of knew what they were going for.
So there was a couple of other big program changes, though, that were not long in coming after that. Nobody has ever been able to establish a firm date of when either the Beeper Show or Swap and Shop started, but it was around this time.
It was around this time because Ryan's interest, and he's really an important figure here, his interests and his experiences were really varied. He was a song and dance kid, and a lot of us who enjoy entertainment really enjoy magic as well, and he really liked it. He was a voracious listener to old-time radio shows like Superman and the Lone Ranger. He miraculously came through a case of polio unscathed. As a teen, he was an amateur boxer, a rally king. He worked on old cars, loved to go to the movies. He liked water skiing, playing tennis, and he was a bit of a card shark. And he was a radio announcer, of course, who worshipped Wolfman Jack. And so in mid-60s, Wolfman Jack, through the 60s, he was a radio personality that anybody and everybody admired. But when we go into the 1960s here, curiously, we do see an entry in the volume 86 Reader's Digest magazine. And they shared one of the earliest definitions for Beeper Show that I found. Beeper Show is kind of a national definition. And it read, just about anybody can get on the radio these days, thanks to the Beeper Show, a two-way conversation program between listener and the disc jockey. It's named for the high-pitched tone that the FCC requires when a telephone conversation is being taped. You had to ask permission from the call-in people to have their voices aired on air. Slips were rare, but they did happen. And there was a gentleman named Paul Benzakin who ran a Beeper Show in Boston that was very, very famous. He was an outspoken feminist and a pioneer of talk radio. He was one of the first broadcasters to be suspended for cursing on the air, uttering profanity in 1968. And he also hosted a late night television show in Boston.
So that Beeper Show, over the years, I've had people ask me, so why is your talk show called the Beeper Show? And it was because of that little tone that back in the old days you had to have behind you if you were putting a caller on the air. And of course, even though we no longer have the tone, the Beeper Show is still very much alive and well today. And we say with a high degree of confidence that it's the longest running radio talk show in Oregon. And it was around this time also that the Swap and Shop program first came to KNND. Now, Swap and Shops, they went by various other names, but they were pretty standard fare on radio stations before Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace and all of these fun things that we have technologically speaking today. But, people have been always looking to save a buck or two, and, swap and shop programs were a great way to do that.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the callers didn't really want to hear the beep. That was the whole thing about the beep, is that you would hear it and it would make think
about how distracting that was.
It was very distracting. In Russia, they had something called the buzzer. And so that's what the shows there were called. They were called the buzzers. And so it was a very distracting sound that you would have to wait until you get on the air to hear. And so that's why a lot of the earlier the earlier radio personalities would just repeat what the caller said, because the caller didn't want to wait on the line hearing the beep. They didn't want to wait as well. They would just quickly talk to the caller, record that conversation on a note, and then they would just repeat it on the air. But in 1966 here, KNND station was playing as much as 12 hours of country western music every single week per day. Reflecting the growth of the company, Viken transferred the broadcast license for KNND to the Interstate Broadcasting Company in 1968. That's when he washed his hands, and it only belonged to Pete Ryan. And around this time, KNND also started airing Major League Baseball games. That's right, as an affiliate of the Seattle Pilots during their only year of existence in 1969, right before the team went bankrupt and was reborn later in 1970 as the Milwaukee Brewers. So we were airing Seattle Pilots games back in 1969 for that year.
Yeah.
Interesting. And everybody loves Candy Radio, so that's what they were going on. And in some of the history that I'm noting from some of the research that I'm doing, a lot of people remember that particular slogan, everybody likes candy. And so that's what the disc jockeys were repeating over and over again. Here we go, and this picture here is just sort of a placeholder. A lot of these pictures I grabbed from the Cottage Grove Museum and the Lane County Museum as well. But it is a picture of Ferguson's Appliance TV, and we have an old Datsun there from the 70s, I think. I think it looks like a 76 to me. But there's a huge Radio Shack sign on there, and it looks like a antenna on top of the building. Lots of signage to televisions and appliances. So KNND in the 1970s, it was
kind of a decade of big change and upheaval for KNND, because it went through a few owners at that point. 1972, the license was transferred to Keith L. and Eleanor B. Stiles, who didn't own it very long. They had it for less than a couple of years, until April 1st of 1974. It was sold again to an entity, KTOB.
Yeah, and they brought in middle-of-the-road music format when it was country western the entire time. Why? Why fix something that isn't broken? But this too was a short-term change.
Yep.
And the station was sold again.
1976, Thornton Flager enters the picture.
And this is an incredible moment here, because the new owners maintained the MOR format throughout the 70s, and so that was really important too.
But there's also something else that deserves mention here too, Gerald. This was when 1975, 1976 was when the radio station moved out of the swamp.
It did move out
They
of the
moved
swamp.
out of the swamp and took up residence right here in good old downtown Cottage Grove at 321 East Main Street. It was the International Order of Oddfellows building, sometimes just called IOOF or Oddfellows. The Oddfellows did a lot of work, really helped to get the studio built, and KNND moved in there in 76 and was there for the next 45 years.
Incredible. And so here we have a picture of Karen Hamilton Williamson. and she's pictured there. She was an on-air personality.
She was program director.
And program director.
She showed up in 1981.
She did, and she understood that having a diverse interest from Beethoven to the Beatles really captured the sound of the future. Country Western was sort of an established sound here in Oregon, but she was willing to take a chance, and she reviewed a lot of music during her time. And on this article, we noticed that the Beeper Talk Show was airing Monday through Wednesday morning, but it was called the Beeper Talk Show. So when we start doing some of our searches through the Oregon archive, I'm looking for Beeper Talk Show, because when I'm looking for Beeper Show, I'm not finding much. So we got to start on that pretty soon. And so by October 1988, the Flakers announced an agreement to sell KNND to
Bob and Diane Orenick.
That's right.
Who kept the Thornton Flager name, however.
Mm-hmm.
They kept their business name and just absorbed the business. Now, the Orenicks, they had it until 2005,
mm-hmm.
and Diane, as many of you know, she's still with us to this day. She is my sales manager, and a better saleswoman is impossible to find.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really, 1980s, 1990s. Those were the kind of the period of the personal computer.
Yeah.
When technology really started to reign supreme at that point. And so I sat down with Diane recently, and I said, so tell me a little bit about the radio station when you and Bob first took it over in 1988. Well, when she and Bob first took it over in 1988, it was not 24/7. It was from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. is what she told me. Mm-hmm. And everything was still done live to that point. And it was still primarily country, but there was a little bit of a mixture of music and formats thrown in there, depending on what the personal taste of the jocks were. So one of the things that she did was she brought in the first computer automation system, and she took the format to a straight country and western format. It was a contemporary top 40 country format. And it was what you heard on KNND. So there's another interesting footnote to the history of the station. Today, KNND has an FM translator at 99.7. But this is not the first time FM has been a part of KNND. Diane and Bob Orenick in 1993, they put a sister station on the air at 100.5. It was KCGR. Does anybody remember KCGR? So that station was kind of a soft rock pop format, kind of similar to what Magic 94.5 was back in those days. But Diane also did something really interesting in an effort to cater to our increasing Latino population that the town was seeing. She also had several hours during the evening that was Hispanic programming. And she had a couple of local DJs that came in and did some Hispanic programming and playing some of their music as well. So that was kind of an interesting little aside there.
Mm-hmm.
So Diane and Bob kept it going until 2005. It remained country throughout those years. The Beeper Show, Swap and Shop, all that fun stuff was still with us. We also did sports broadcasts. That was another thing, as Gerald mentioned. When Diane came, she was reflecting on how the station was kind of known as a sports station, because not only did we broadcast the games of the Pilots, but we also did Blazers games at one point, mm-hmm. which I did not know. And of course, we've always done the Lions, mm-hmm. Their football, basketball, sometimes baseball. Mm-hmm. And I know that back in the day, we would also broadcast some of the Crestwell Bulldogs games as well. So that was going on until 2005. Mm-hmm. those two stations were sold separately in 2005. I'm just going to go over KCGR and what happened to it. So KCGR was sold to Steve Masters, who turned it into something interesting. It was kind of a non-political talk format. It was kind of a business talk format, and it remained there for a while. The call letters of the station from 2005 to 2011 were actually KDPM, and then it for a while was a hip hop station. And at some point, the call letters were changed again to KMME, and it is now a religious station broadcasting Catholic programming, although its area of focus has been sort of changed to Eugene Springfield. So thus was the outcome of the other FM station that was formerly associated with KNND. And KNND, a lot of the news programming that aired on KNND would be aired on KCGR. So when I originally started back in the early 2000s and I was doing news stories, I had to say Cameron Reiten reporting for KNND KCGR because my stories and a lot of the newscasts were simulcast on those two stations. And the other thing that was kind of fun was when KNND, when we used to do remotes in my early days at the station, we would simulcast those on KCGR. So in an effort to try to bridge the formats, because KCGR was soft rock pop, KNND was top 40 country, we would go oldies when we did remotes on KNND KCGR.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, why don't we go on that? So tell us a little bit about your really early history to develop this bug that you had for radio.
Well, I was very much interested in a lot of those old-time radio shows that you were talking about. Lone Ranger, Shadow, Dragnet, Green Hornet, Fibber McGee and Molly, all the good ones. Tales of the Texas Rangers. I mean, there was so much great talent on the air back in the day. I mean, that's when the 30s, 40s, 50s, it was kind of known as the golden age of radio. And it's kind of interesting that KNND came on the air in 1953. Cottage Grove has always been a little bit technologically behind the times because really by 1953, the golden age of radio was sort of tailing off at that point because there was this newfangled thing called television that was showing up in more American homes by then. So radio was gradually being given over to music as a lot of those great shows were either going off the air or just moving over to television. I mean, you had shows like Gunsmoke that started on radio, and of course it had a very long run on TV. I mentioned Dragnet. That had a popular TV side as well for years. So there was a lot of those shows that moved to TV, and radio became more music at that point.
And so you had a really strong influence by somebody.
Yes.
And so in 2003, like you mentioned, you stepped through KNND's doors for the first time. And what was that feeling like for you, Cameron?
Well, it was even though it was just a small station in my hometown, it was frankly awe-inspiring. I met a gentleman by the name of Paul Schwartzberg at a career fair at Cottage Grove High School. This was in the spring of 2003, and Paul was the news director and sales associate working for Diana Rennick at that time, and he also hosted the Beeper Show. And the timing actually worked out, couldn't have possibly been more perfect, because in May of 2005, Paul ends up buying the radio station from Diane and Bob. Well, what happens in June of 2005? Somebody named Cameron Reiten graduates from Cottage Grove High School. And I was looking for a job at that point. I was going to school at LCC. I was a student by day, or I was a student by night and radio guy by day. Working for I worked for two owners. I worked for the O'Rennicks and then Paul. and I originally started. I was doing news, and basically what my first job was as an unpaid intern. I would rush home from school in the afternoon, and I had this little cassette recorder that was hooked to my telephone, and I would call newsmakers in the community and get actualities or cuts that I would then deliver the tapes back to the radio station, and Paul would make news stories out of them.
Wow.
That was my first job at KNND.
That's so cool. That is so cool. Just being involved in your local community and getting it all on the air. That is absolutely fascinating. So tell me maybe about some of the impressions that Paul made on you that you still maybe carry today.
Well, I think one of the big things that I always learned from him is, always smile. There's absolutely no bad days in radio. And the other thing is, that it's still possible, even though you might meet somebody and have polar opposite political views, for instance. There's still things that you can admire and respect about those folks, even if you see the world differently.
Absolutely.
And so that's been one of the things that I've always tried to carry forward today as I host the Beeper Show, particularly in the light of the polarized environment that we seem to be living in at this point.
Exactly. As we've noticed now throughout history, it always seems to have been there, and arguments on the radio seem to be ratings getters, and bad news always seems to lead. But here in Cottage Grove, we have so much good news that we can easily fill up an entire hour with just that alone. And here's some other good news. In 2014, something happened, Cameron.
Yes. Well, it was actually a little bit of an interesting thing. It took the FCC a little while to get all the paperwork pushed through for actually making me official owner of the radio station. So for a while, for a few months, I was owner general manager, but we were operating under a limited an LMA, limited marketing agreement. So technically the license was still in the name of Schwartzberg Communications Inc. at that point, but I say June 1st, 2013 was when I took over the station, because that's when everything. That's when the buck stopped at my desk.
There you go. There you go. And how lucky is that? Look at that. Just to own the station where you started as an intern. Wow. It's like owning the grocery store. I was starting out as a bag boy. It's incredible. And so you've been able to develop KNND in this really, really amazing way, where you have all of your favorite things there at the station, like your collection of old telephones. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I've been collecting telephones since I was a little kid, basically the only reason they're there is because I had them. I'm proud of them. I wanted to show them off. And I'm thinking, okay, I own a business and I own a building. I now have a space, and so I'm going to put them up.
Fantastic. And then you have your collection of albums
vinyl.
there.
Yes.
Vinyl. Oh, it's just...
I actually still play vinyl on the air. As much as KNND has, we've got computers, we've got CD players, all that fun stuff. I still play records.
Is that one of your more favorite formats?
It is.
Well, because
you're not going to corrupt a record.
You can't corrupt it, and it also shows character through the ages on there too.
And KNND, let me just close this loop for us, because KNND has always been a station that appreciates history. If you've seen a picture of Paul, or you met Paul when he was in this community, he was a big 50s rocker, kind of dressed like one of the 50s rockers. So there was a time, I believe it was back in 2007, when KNND actually had a few years of departure from its country format, and we went oldies. We were oldies rock and roll for a few years. So that stayed for a while. In 2014, we went back to country, but I wanted to be something a little bit different from the big time stations up north. So what I did, instead of going, top 40 contemporary country, I went to a format which kind of blends older country and some of the newer country, but with a heavy emphasis on the traditional sound. Because what I kept hearing was, hey, I don't like where country's going. It's this, pop, rap, crap. It's just horrible. I want real country with fiddles and steel guitars and songs about beer drinking because my wife left me and my dog died and my truck broke down. So I went with a traditional country sound, and that is where we are today. And it's worked out well. But Lloyd Williams, who is in the audience, hosts Monday Gold. One of my favorites, and Rock and Rob Ward is on Wednesday. So if you like your oldies, you can still get your fix there. And for those who are religiously inclined, we have Cindy Wheeldryer, who I believe is also with us tonight. And it's kind of funny because the first broadcast on KNND was a religious program. Well, that is something that continues on Sundays. To this day.
And KNND has also absorbed a lot of different events over the years too.
It has.
So you've taken over things like the Rock and Roll Rumble.
The Rock, Roll, and Rumble, it was the South Lane Cruise back in the day. The South Lane Cruisers kind of got to the point where they wanted to retire and hang it up. I can't take a lot of credit for that because that was during the Paul Schwartzberg era, but he said, hey, you know what? I love old cars. It's an excuse to play old music. So let's take over the cruise, and we did that, and we took over the Show and Shine a few years later. KNND, I have always had a huge love and appreciation for our downtown district, which was why when I had the opportunity come up, just to kind of put one last note on our history here to take us up to the present, there came a time when KNND's lease with IOOF expired and we had to find a new home. At that point, as many of you will remember, because the Brandt family ran automotive grinding for 60 years, they were looking to sell the building, and they came to me and they said, how would you like to buy this building? And the timing all just kind of worked out. So we took over the old AGS building and built a studio in it. In fact, Lloyd and Cindy were both around for all of that fun. And it was I must say that was really interesting. I found a lot of cool things when we were hauling 45 years of accumulation out from the IOF building and moving it to our current location. For example, a 1981 ticket for a U2 concert, for which the price of admission was $7.50.
I'll take it. I'll take 10.
So that kind of brings us up to where we are today, and we're still country. We still love the good stuff and nothing but the good stuff. And now we even have an FM translator thanks to South Lane TV. They were big partners in that with us. I'd be remiss not to thank South Lane TV and acknowledge their enormous support of KNND. So now we're on 99.7 on your FM dial, in addition to 47.4 on the South Lane TV translator system.
And you're still doing live shows with features like the Grapevine ads.
Oh yeah.
And Animal Lost and Found.
Yep.
You're still doing things like the spring alligator auction once a year.
We do that in the spring and the fall.
Now you've got two of them going
on.
There's
things that have changed, but there's been things that have stayed the same.
Exactly. And then we also have things like BMD, which you are, you participate in as well as one of the sound engineers there. And we talked about Lions Club Radio Days, which Orlo Bagley started, and things like Tree of Joy. So you're out there and providing a lot for our community. You've been honored by the Chamber of Commerce, by your own profession, and you're doing a fantastic job keeping Cottage Grove informed of lots of amazing things that are going on here, Cameron. And we appreciate you very much for continuing to hold the torch to old media. And yeah, it's just an important element to have here in town, I think.
Well, we appreciate the Sentinel as well.
Well, of course, and we work well together, I think, and we look forward to having more shows together like this.
Gerald,
Yes.
Cameron has been inducted in the National Broadcast Hall of Fame.
Look at that.
Get mentioned.
Yes, you've been inducted into the National Broadcast Hall of Fame. Amazing. Just amazing. Just amazing. Well, I mean, you're an amazing person, and it is an amazing radio station that has a clearly defined history with a lot of great folks that provided so much to give Cottage Grove entertainment over the years. People working on end to continue the sort of like a old dinosaur. It seems to be dying off, but for a lot of us who really still enjoy this kind of medium, we're there every day for it. And yeah, I think we've reached the end of our show here.
I think we get to give some prizes away.
We get to give some prizes away after some trivia questions here.
So let's get our hostess with the mostest back up here. Can we give a great big round of applause to Debbie Monson?